Yeast has been used since the beginnings of civilizations. Ancient Egyptians used yeast. It is one of the first organisms domesticated by the humanity. The same importance has accomplished the brewing. That is one of the many uses yeast has. Beer brewing has been an extended practice since centuries. Monks during the Middle Ages perfected and developed beer brewing techniques, writing and sharing recipes that are still used by the great companies of beer nowadays. This beverage accomplishes an important social and cultural role in our society. Its meanings are different but shared in every region of the world. The purpose of this investigation is solving one of the many questionings that the consumer may have about beer. What is the effect of the amount of yeast used in the beer brewing process in the amount of alcohol that the final product will have? Through this text, several things will be explained, such as the different elements, chemical and biological, present in the brewing process, the actual process of the beer brewing, and the results that an experiment conducted by the authors of this text will show the final answer to one of the many questions that a person can ask about something with such a cultural connotation.
For our theoretical framework, we are going to have into account four elements: layer yeast, fermentation, and beer brewing, and enzymes. Layer yeast is the biological component that produces ethanol in our beer brewing, being this the thing that, through cellular respiration, taking glucose from the malt, produces the ethanol that is the alcoholic element in the beer. Fermentation is the process where this happens. Basically, is leaving the yeast make action into our mixes. And this produces ethanol, and it's very important to have ethanol and alcohol as it is part of our question. Beer brewing is basically the process we're making, and we have to analyze its history. That it began in the Egyptian Empire in the 5000 before Christ. Its procedures, its materials that you can see in the methodology um, after this, and the enzymes that is the chemical, biological, and basically the explanation of why ethanol happens, why layer yeast produces ethanol, and we had the enzymes in the brewing process, in the malting and smashing, the enzymes in the fermentation process, and how these enzymes were produced, and how these enzymes helped us to understand the beer brewing and its process and why things happen in beer brewing.
So for our methodology, first we designed a theoretical class. So for the theoretical class, we developed a virtual concept map in which we explain our main concepts based on alcoholic fermentation. We explained to the students the procedure of our experiment, and we gave them indications of what they were going to do in the experimental class. And we evaluate information management 2 and critical thinking 1. After that, we developed the experiment. So the first thing that we developed was preparing the pre-lab. After the explanation of the experiment in the theoretical class, the students knew the instructions they had to follow in order to have a successful experiment. In this part, the malt of barley was placed for around 80 minutes in a pot of warm water with a temperature of 67 to 70 degrees. For every kilo of malt, we use around 12 liters of water. Here, the starch transforms into sugars, and we got a sweet and dense liquid. So then, after the pre-lab, we had to stay after class and started with the part 1 of the experiment. In this part, we started with the boiling, in which we boiled for around an hour, in which we added hops that will give the bitterness and flavor to the beer. So we cooled the liquid in order to develop the next step. So finally, in this first part of the experiment, we developed a process in which the mixture was into a fermentation container where we added the yeast, which had the role of converting sugars into alcohol. We put the samples into bottles in order to start fermentation that took around 10 days. So, after the first experiment, we proceed to the second part of the experiment. This experiment started with the maturation and bottleneck. Once the fermentation process is over, the beer was passed to another can. We did this in order to discard the bed of yeast that was during fermentation. In this process, which lasts 1 week, the quality of the samples was better, and it clarified the beer. After that, we used the technique of natural carbonation with sugars in the bottle. We calculate 7 to 8 grams of sugar per liter of the samples. We used a minimum amount of water in order that the heat of the sugars was boiled for a few minutes. Then we added to the samples without letting the beer take contact with the air in order to avoid oxidation. Afterwards, the beer was placed in bottles, and we were covered. We wait 10 more days. We had to check the beer by analyzing gas in order to determine if the beer was optimal to be consumed. An important fact was that for the carbonization process was that the bottles were kept at a room temperature and not in a refrigerator. This was because the cold would affect the yeast.
Is an organic, non-toxic, and biodegradable
after
fuel made
all
from everyday
the
renewable resources like
methodology, all the
vegetable oils
experiments,
or
and all the
animal fats.
analysis
It
of
can
the
power
data,
your car's
we
engine
had to
and
state
help the
a real
environment at
case
the same
problem.
time.
So our
It doesn't
real
contain
life
any
situation
petroleum, so
was
forget about
excessive
escalating gas
use of
prices.
fossil fuel and no
Biodiesel
renewable
cuts down on
sources of
CO2
energy.
emissions,
So
away
we
from
said
pets
that
and children.
the usage of these sources
Before you
of
begin making your
energy
biodiesel
supposes
home
the
brew, follow these simple
exploitation
steps and
of
find out how to
different
filter your
earth
used cooking
resources
oil and
that
ensure a good batch of
resulted
biodiesel.
in
New cooking oil,
irreversible
or you can find a
damages on the
restaurant and ask
ecosystem.
them if you can take
So
their used cooking oil
for
off their
this
hands. Used cooking oil will
real
have a
life
darker color
situation,
to it and will
we
most
use
likely
these
have chunks of your
sources
favorite fried foods
right
floating
here.
around.
And then
You will need to get rid
based
of
on the
these
sources,
mystery
we said
chunks
that
before making
this
your
problem
biodiesel
can be
home
solved
brew.
by the
Filtering your used
usage
cooking oil will
of
eliminate the
yeast.
chunks of food and
We
other
related
particles
with
before
our
you begin your
investigation,
biodiesel
and we said
homebrew
the process
process.
of fermentation
Larger chunks
results
can
in
contain
the
water and can
production
mess
of
up your
ethanol
biodiesel
that
reaction.
can be used
Smaller
and
suspended
as
particles should also be allowed to settle so they don't attach to your
sources
heating
of
element and muck up
energy.
your processor.
Ethanol can be
As you pour out
produced
your used
safely
cooking
and
oil,
through
let it
natural
run completely
processes
through the
as
filter.
we did in our
The filter doesn't
experiment
need to
and
be
in
too
our
fine.
investigation.
A paint strainer
So
or
as you
window
can
screen
see,
will adequately remove the particles that are
here
large
is
enough to affect
a
the
concept map
biodiesel reacting oil off their
in which
hands.
we state
Used cooking
the
oil will
yeast
have a
fuels.
darker color to it
So
and will
the
most likely have
research of
chunks of your
making
favorite fried
ethanol
foods floating
biofuels,
around.
they acquired
You will
the
need to get
yeast
rid of
and
these
other
mystery
materials,
chunks before
start
making
the
your biodiesel
fermentation of
homebrew.
grains with the yeast.
Congratulations!
For
You've just
isolate the
properly filtered your
ethanol,
used
5
cooking oil
compose
and
the
can begin your
biofuel based on
biodiesel
the
homebrew
research made
process.
in point
By
1
choosing to
and
use an
6,
alternative fuel,
test
you've
for
helped to cut down on
combustion
CO2
and
emissions,
effectiveness.
cut dependence on foreign
And
oil,
that's the way
and
we
saved
state
yourself
our
some money.
real life problem based on our investigation.
After gathering all the information, we ended up with this table. You can see the results here. We can see that um, the first mix that had 1 gram of yeast had an average of 1.35% of alcohol. The second mix that had 3.8 grams of yeast had an average of 2.27 percentage of alcohol. And the third mix that is of 5.7 grams of yeast has a 3.18% of alcohol. We can see that effectively the amount of yeast we used affected the amount of alcohol percentage we had. We also had to apply some t-tests to see the real difference of the value, the standard deviation, the distribution of data, to see if we had conclusive information, and we did had conclusive information. We can say that effectively the amount of yeast you use to make a beer brewing affects on its alcohol percentage in the way that more yeast results on more percentage of alcohol.
Conclusions. The amount of lager yeast in a beer put in the process of production do affect the volume of alcohol percentage it have. The less lager yeast it is put on the mix during the process of production of the beer will give a result a lower volume of alcohol. If only 1 gram of lager yeast is used on the beer production, its alcohol volume will be of 1.35. The more lager yeast is put on the mix during the process or production of the beer will give as a result a higher volume of alcohol. If 5.7 grams of the yeast are used on its production, the volume of alcohol will be 3.18.